They fired Mara Kinsley in front of 47 people on a Tuesday morning, and not one of them said a word, not a murmur, not a cough. Just the sound of her chair scraping back against the floor of the Alderton and Marsh boardroom, the soft click of her keycard being placed on the table, and then silence so complete it seemed to have weight. That was 5 years ago, and not a single person in that office ever heard from Mara Kinsley again, until now, because the woman who had just stepped through the revolving door of the Alderton and Marsh headquarters, tall, calm, wearing a coat that probably cost more than most people's rent, was not the same person who had walked out of that building with a cardboard box and wet eyes in February of 2020. She was something else entirely. She was the new owner. But before any of that, before the reckoning and the silence and the thing that happened with the coffee cart in the lobby, Mara needed to park her car, and her car at that particular moment was refusing to cooperate. The parking garage was underground, cool and echoing, and the ticket machine at the entrance had decided, apparently, that it was done for the day. Mara pressed the button, nothing. She pressed it again, still nothing. She leaned out her window and looked at the machine the way a person looks at someone who has just said something personally offensive. "I pressed it correctly," she told the machine. "I know I pressed it correctly because I have a master's degree in financial management and I have been pressing buttons my entire adult life." The machine blinked once. No ticket appeared. "Fine." She tried again. "We can do this the slow way. I have time. I have more time than you do, actually, because you are a machine and therefore you do not have time, so statistically, I win." A car pulled up behind her. Mara smiled at the rearview mirror, the kind of smile that means I am handling this. She pressed the button one more time. The machine made a sound. A small, grudging mechanical sound, and then a ticket appeared, slowly, as if it were doing her a personal favor. "Thank you," Mara said. "And I want you to know that was unnecessarily dramatic." She took the ticket and pulled into the garage. The car behind her honked once. "You're welcome," she said to no one. Mara Kinsley was 32 years old. She had grown up in Fredericton, New Brunswick, moved to Toronto for university, and then spent 6 years at Alderton and Marsh Financial Group working in mid-level acquisitions analysis before being escorted, very publicly, out of the building by her then director, Stuart Oakes, who had decided, in front of the entire floor, that she was the reason the Callaway account had collapsed. She wasn't. She had the emails to prove it. But at the time she had been 27 and alone and so stunned by the public nature of it that she hadn't said anything at all. She had just picked up her cardboard box and walked to the elevator. She had cried exactly once in the parking garage in her car for 11 minutes. Then she had driven home, made tea, and started building something new. The lobby of Alderton and Marsh was exactly as she remembered it, marble floors. The fountain near the reception desk that always sounded slightly too loud. The security desk to the left, the glass elevators. And in the corner, near the far window, a small cart where a woman was setting up the morning coffee station. Mara walked to it. The woman behind the cart was young, maybe 24, with a ponytail and an apron that said A&M Hospitality in block letters. She was arranging paper cups with a kind of focused energy that suggested she took the arrangement very seriously. "Good morning," Mara said. The woman looked up. "Morning. What can I get you? Whatever your best thing is." The woman smiled. It was the first genuinely warm smile Mara had encountered since entering the building. "Oat milk latte. I know the machine better than anyone. You and machines," Mara said, thinking of the parking garage. "You deserve a medal." The woman laughed and started making the drink. Her name tag said Penny. She moved quickly, efficiently, in a way that suggested she had been doing this for a long time and had made peace with it. "First day?" Penny asked. "Something like that. Visiting someone?" Mara looked at the marble lobby, at the fountain, at the glass elevators where two men in suits were already deep in a conversation that looked important and probably wasn't. More of a return visit. Penny handed her the cup. Mara took a sip. It was excellent. "That," Mara said, "is genuinely the best latte I've had in months." Penny looked pleased in a way that was not performative. "I've been here 3 years. I know every setting on that machine. What's your name?" "Penny Hartwell, Mara Kinsley." She extended her hand. Penny shook it, slightly confused by the formality, but friendly about it. "Are you nervous?" Penny asked. "You don't look nervous. But people who are really nervous usually don't look it." Mara considered the question honestly. "Not nervous, something else." "I'm not sure there's a word for it," settled, Penny said. "My grandmother used to call it settled, when you've made a decision and you're just walking toward it." Mara looked at her. "That's exactly the right word." She picked up her coffee and walked toward the elevators. Behind her, she heard Penny hum something quiet to herself and start rearranging the cups again. Stuart Oakes had been the director of acquisitions at Alderton and Marsh for 11 years. He had a large corner office on the 14th floor, a parking space with his name stenciled on the concrete, and a habit of straightening his tie whenever he was about to say something he thought was important. He had been straightening it constantly for the past 3 days, ever since word had come down from the board that the firm had been acquired by a private investment group out of Vancouver called Kinsley Capital. He had not connected the name. This was a mistake. He was on the phone when his assistant, a careful and watchful man named Gordon who had worked with Stuart for 7 years and quietly disliked him for 6 of them, knocked on the office door. "Your 9 o'clock is here," Gordon said. "I'm on a call. She said she'll wait." "She?" Stuart frowned. "The new ownership rep is a she?" "Yes, fine, 5 minutes." Gordon closed the door. He walked back to the small reception area outside the office, where Mara Kinsley was sitting in one of the low chairs, holding her oat milk latte and looking out the window at the city below, with an expression that Gordon found unusual for someone about to meet Stuart. She looked calm. Most people who were about to meet Stuart were not calm. "He'll be another few minutes," Gordon said. "Can I get you anything?" "I'm fine, thank you." She looked at him. "How long have you worked here?" Gordon blinked. No one ever asked him that. 7 years. "Do you like it?" Another pause. "I like my work." Mara smiled at the careful distinction. "Good answer." Stuart came out 5 minutes later, still straightening his tie. He was 51, thick through the shoulders, with the particular confidence of someone who had never been seriously challenged in a professional setting. He extended his hand before he had fully registered who was sitting there. "Stuart Oakes, Director of Acquisitions," he smiled. "And you must be the representative from—" He stopped. The handshake happened. His hand was already out. Mara stood and took it. "Mara Kinsley," she said. "Founder and CEO of Kinsley Capital. We met once before, actually. But the context was a little different." Stuart's face did something complicated, several things in quick succession: recognition, disbelief. The particular kind of dread that arrives when something you assumed was finished turns out to be very much ongoing. "Kinsley," he said. "Yes, from Acquisitions Analysis, 2019 and 2020. I was on your team." Silence. Gordon, who was still standing slightly to the left, looked at the floor, but his mouth was doing something that was not quite a smile. "Why don't we go into your office," Mara said pleasantly, "and talk about the transition plan?" Stuart went pale. Then he stepped back and gestured toward the door in a way that was technically polite, but felt like a man trying to decide whether he was still in charge of anything. They sat across from each other at his very large desk, and Mara opened her portfolio and started talking about restructuring timelines. And Stuart sat across from her and said the right words when required and spent the rest of the time trying to understand how this had happened and whether there was anything at all he could do about it. There wasn't. The building's main staff kitchen was on the 10th floor, and Mara had discovered it at 11:40 that morning while looking for a water glass. She had also discovered that the 10th floor was where most of the junior analysts sat, and that they were, almost universally, eating lunch at their desks in the slightly hunched posture of people who had been told, in many small ways, that taking a full lunch break was not something that was done here. She was filling a glass at the sink when she heard a sound from behind the refrigerator. Not a dramatic sound, a small one. The sound of someone trying very quietly to get a container of leftover pasta unstuck from the back of the shelf without moving the 6 other containers that were precariously balanced in front of it. "It's the second shelf," a voice said. "If you tilt it up slightly to the right, it clears the edge." Mara turned around. The woman on the floor, half behind the open fridge door, looked up at her with the particular expression of someone who has been caught in an undignified position and has decided the only reasonable response is complete honesty. "The hinges are slightly off," the woman said, "so everything slides toward the back. I've been meaning to report it for 6 months. I keep forgetting. Have you tried a note?" "I wrote 3. They landed in the general suggestions box and were presumably never read." "What's in the suggestions box?" "Dust, I think, and a 2021 calendar." Mara reached in, tilted the container slightly up and to the right, and it slid out cleanly. "Thank you," the woman said, standing up. She was about Mara's age, with paint on one knuckle and a pen tucked behind each ear, which suggested she was either very organized or had completely given up on organization. "I'm Josephine." She stopped. "Wait, no. Sorry, I go by Joe. My mother named me after her favorite aunt, and I've been diplomatically shortening it since 1995. Mara laughed. It surprised her slightly the way genuine laughs sometimes do. "Mara, are you visiting or new?" "New," Mara said. "Sort of." Joe tilted her head. Sort of new is an interesting category. It's a long story. I like long stories. Jo peeled the lid off her pasta. I have 40 minutes and a fridge that owes me, so I'm prepared to listen. They ate at the small table near the window. Jo worked in the internal communications department, which meant she spent most of her time writing memos that she suspected nobody read and designing internal presentations that were used once and then filed somewhere unreachable. It's not, she said, chasing a piece of penna, the most electrifying work. Do you like it? I like the writing parts. I like making things clear. I like taking something that's convoluted and finding the simplest honest version of it. She paused. The part I don't like is when someone changes all my words to make them sound more corporate and the clear version becomes the convoluted version again. Who does that? Usually people with titles that have the word senior in them. Mara noted this. What would you actually want to do? If it were up to you? Jo looked at her, mildly suspicious of the question, but answered it anyway. Honestly, I'd want to design a better internal feedback system. The way this company communicates internally is, she stopped. I should probably be more careful about what I say to people I just met. Probably, Mara agreed. But you could also just finish the sentence. Jo looked at her for another moment. Then she finished the sentence. By the time Mara walked back to the 14th floor, she had a pasta stain on her sleeve, a piece of information about the internal communications department that she was going to use, and the particular feeling she sometimes got when she recognized that she was standing at the start of something interesting. She did not yet know that Josephine Hartwell, who went by Jo, who had paint on her knuckle and pens behind both ears, was also Penny's older sister. That would come later. The afternoon meeting with the department heads was scheduled for 3 o'clock in the large conference room on the 14th floor. Mara arrived 2 minutes early and sat at the head of the table, which was technically hers to sit at, and which nevertheless made 4 of the 8 people in the room visibly uncomfortable. Stewart sat 2 seats down, on the right, with the careful body language of someone who has spent the last 4 hours recalibrating his expectations of the day. Gordon sat near the door, very still, with the expression of someone watching a nature documentary reach its pivotal scene. Mara set her portfolio on the table and looked around the room. Thank you for coming, she said. I'll be brief because I know you all have actual work to do. She folded her hands. The acquisition is complete. Kinsley Capital now holds majority ownership of Alderton and Marsh. That doesn't mean the firm disappears. It means it changes. Some of those changes will be welcome. Some will be difficult. I'll be transparent about all of them. A man near the window, 50s, silver hair, the cautious face of someone who has survived several previous restructurings, raised his hand. What's the timeline? 90 days for the initial review. 60 days after that for implementation of the first phase, and the criteria for, he paused, for staffing decisions, performance, Mara said, and culture. Those 2 things together, she let that sit for a moment. I want to be clear about something. I'm not interested in making this painful for people who've been doing good work. I'm also not interested in protecting people who haven't been. So if you're asking what I'm looking for, that's the answer. Silence. Stewart's jaw moved slightly, as if he were trying to think of something to say and had not yet found it. Any other questions? Mara asked. No one spoke. Good. She picked up her portfolio. I'll be spending time on every floor over the next few weeks. I'd encourage people to speak with me directly if they have concerns. My assistant will send calendar availability. She stood. Everyone else stood too, almost involuntarily, the way people do when a room shifts its orientation without quite announcing it. As the meeting broke up, Gordon appeared at her elbow, quiet and efficient. That went well, he said. You think? The survival rate of people who make it through your first meeting without asking a hostile question is historically very good. He paused. In my experience, Mara looked at him. How long have you actually been wanting to say something like that to someone in that room? Gordon considered this with appropriate gravity. 6 years and approximately 4 months. She nodded. Make sure you send me your full thoughts on the internal structure at some point. Not in a memo. Just a conversation. Gordon looked at her the way a person looks when they have expected something ordinary and received something else entirely. Yes, he said. I'll do that. The problem with the coffee cart in the lobby happened on Thursday, which was Mara's 4th day back in the building. She had developed, over those 4 days, a habit of stopping at Penny's cart on the way in and the way out. This had nothing to do with strategic networking. The coffee was genuinely excellent, and Penny was the only person in the building who didn't look at Mara with an expression somewhere between calculation and mild anxiety. On Thursday morning, Mara stepped off the elevator into the lobby with a folder under one arm and her bag over the opposite shoulder, and she managed to somehow, in the crossing of these two objects, lose her grip on the folder. It opened on the way down. Papers went to the left. Her badge went forward. A pen rolled toward the fountain. 12 pages of the preliminary restructuring assessment landed in a loose arc across the marble floor. Mara stood still for a moment and looked at the evidence of this. "I did not do that gracefully," she said to no one in particular. Penny was already coming around the side of the cart with a handful of pages. 2 security guards bent down to collect the rest. A third person, a man in his early 40s who had just come through the revolving door and looked like someone who had been awake for a very long time, picked up the pen near the fountain and brought it over. Mara gathered the pages. She put them back in the folder without looking at them, in whatever order they came, because the alternative was stopping and doing this properly, and she was not going to do that in the middle of the lobby. "Thank you," she said to the general collection of helpers. That was a team effort. The man who had retrieved the pen, tall, slightly rumpled in the way of people who travel frequently, with the look of someone who has recently had a complicated week, didn't quite smile but came close to it. "I've had mornings like this. Was your morning also on a marble floor in front of 40 people? "Once, yes. A different city. Did it get better?" He thought about it with what appeared to be genuine consideration. "Not immediately, but eventually." Penny handed Mara her latte. "I saw the whole thing." Very dignified. "Please don't put that in writing." "I won't. I'm terrible at writing." Penny looked at the man. "You're supposed to be upstairs. You have an 8:30. He looked at his watch with the mild alarm of someone who had genuinely forgotten. "What floor?" 14. "Right." He started toward the elevators, then paused and turned back. "I hope the rest of your morning is structurally sounder," he told Mara. "That," she said, "is an unexpectedly kind thing to say." He went to the elevators. Mara looked at Penny. "Who is that?" Penny smiled the way people smile when they know something interesting. "He's on the board. His name is Callum. Sorry, wait." She stopped. "Sorry, I always say his first name. Lorne? Theodore Lorne. He's been on the board since 2021. He doesn't come in very often. Usually he's somewhere else. Somewhere else where? His family has a timber business up in northern BC. He splits his time." Penny handed someone else a cup. "He's very quiet, but he's one of the only people on the board who ever came over and introduced himself to me." Mara thought about this. "What did he say?" "He asked me what I thought the firm's biggest internal problem was." Penny tilted her head. "I told him about the suggestions box." "What did he say to that?" "He wrote something down." Penny shrugged. Nothing changed, but he was the only one who asked. Mara looked at the elevator. The doors had already closed. She went back to thinking about the 14th floor. She ran into Theodore Lorne again on Friday afternoon, in the stairwell between 11 and 12. This was unusual. No one used the stairwell between 11 and 12. It was a transitional space, a non-place that existed only to connect two places that people cared about, and Mara had started using it specifically because it was always empty and she could think clearly in it. She came down from 12, turning the corner at the landing, and nearly walked directly into him. They both stopped. He was carrying a coffee from somewhere that was not the lobby cart, which struck Mara as a slightly disloyal choice. "You use the stairs," he said. "I think better when I'm moving." She looked at his coffee. "That's not from Penny's cart. Penny wasn't there when I came in. I didn't want to wait. She gets there at 7:30. You must have been very early." He looked at her with an expression that was not unfriendly but was also not immediately readable. "You're precise. I work in acquisitions. Precision is the job." She shifted her bag on her shoulder. "You're on the board." "I am." "You didn't say anything in the meeting Wednesday." "No, are you opposed to the changes or just watching?" He was quiet for a moment. It was not the quiet of someone who hadn't understood the question. It was the quiet of someone deciding how honestly to answer it. "Neither, exactly," he said at last. "I've been on this board for 3 years. I've watched the firm make the same 3 mistakes in a cycle and convince themselves each time it was progress." He shifted the coffee to his other hand. "When the acquisition came through, I was the one who flagged the name." Mara went still. "You knew who Kinsley Capital was." "I connected the name in the first week of due diligence." He met her eyes. "I didn't tell the other board members." "Why not?" "Because they would have tried to block it." He said it simply, without drama. "And I didn't think they should." The stairwell was quiet around them. 11 flights of industrial concrete and the faint hum of the ventilation system. "That's a significant decision," Mara said. "Yes, you took a risk. Calculated risks are the only kind worth taking." He paused. Also, I read everything Kinsley Capital had published publicly before the deal closed. The work is excellent. Mara looked at him for a long moment. Most people don't say things like that directly. Most people also use the elevator. He nodded toward the stairwell door. I'll let you get back to thinking. He went up. She went down. On the landing between 10 and 9, she paused and looked at the wall and said to the concrete, "That was a strange conversation." The wall did not respond, which she considered appropriate. The story of what happened in the conference room on the 15th day began the way most significant things began in corporate buildings, with a meeting that had been scheduled as a routine check-in and turned into something else entirely. Stewart had called it. Technically, he still had the authority to call departmental review meetings, and he had used it, gathering the senior team for what the calendar invitation called a Q4 readiness review, which was not a thing that had previously existed, and which Gordon had looked at, then looked away from, with the expression of a man who has seen this particular kind of storm before. Mara was not on the invitation list. This was intentional. She found out about it from Joe, who found out from Gordon, who mentioned it in the specific, careful way of someone who is providing information without technically doing anything wrong. Joe texted her, "There's a meeting on 15 at 2 p.m. No agenda was shared. I'm only on the guest list because I designed the slides. I thought you should know." Mara looked at her phone, then she looked at the clock. It was 1:52. She picked up her coffee and took the elevator to 15. The conference room was glass-walled, which meant she could see into it from the corridor, and what she could see was Stewart standing at the far end of the table, speaking to 12 people with the particular energy of someone who has been waiting a long time to say something. On the screen behind him was a slide that said, "Kinsley Capital, what we know." Mara stood in the corridor and drank her coffee and read as much of the slide as she could from outside. It contained several things that were accurate, one thing that was misleading, and one claim about the intended timeline for staff changes that was completely fabricated. She finished the coffee, set the cup on the small side table in the corridor, straightened her jacket, then she knocked on the glass door and opened it. The room stopped. 12 faces turned toward her. Stewart's face did the complicated sequence again, the one she was beginning to recognize. "I hope I'm not interrupting a Q4 readiness review," Mara said. She walked to the table and pulled out the chair at the far end, the other head of the table, and sat down. "Oh good, it looks like there's a slide presentation. I love slide presentations." Joe, sitting near the side wall, looked at the table and did not look up for several seconds. When she did, her face was extremely controlled, which Mara took as a positive sign. "Mara," Stewart began. I was just briefing your team," she said helpfully. "About the acquisition, that's completely appropriate." She folded her hands on the table. "Please continue." Stewart looked at the slide behind him. He looked at the room. He looked at Mara, the slide. He cleared his throat. "There are some details here that I was still confirming. I noticed." She kept her voice pleasant. "Specifically the part about the phase staff reduction timeline. That particular detail hasn't been finalized, so I'm not sure where it came from. But we can clarify that now, which is helpful." She looked around the room. "The timeline is still under internal review," she said. "What I can tell you is this. No decisions have been made about staffing that haven't been communicated directly to the affected parties. If you hear something different, ask me directly. My calendar is open." A woman near the left wall. She had been sitting with her arms crossed but uncrossed them now. "Can we do that? Just book a meeting and ask you directly?" "Yes," Mara said. "That's what I just said." She looked at the woman. "What's your name?" "Petra Holst." "Corporate risk, Petra. What's your biggest concern right now?" Petra blinked. Then, with the expression of someone who has been waiting to say this for a very long time, she said it, all of it. About the communication gaps and the backlog in the risk review process and the thing that had been submitted to Stewart's inbox 14 months ago and never acknowledged. The room was quiet as she finished. Stewart looked at his own hands. Mara nodded slowly. "Okay, I want a meeting with you next week. Bring everything." She looked at the rest of the room. "This applies to everyone here. If you have something in your inbox that's been sitting, bring it." She stood. "I'll let you finish your Q4 readiness review." She picked up her jacket. "Also, the slide in the background has a typo in the third bullet. Just so it's clean." She walked out. In the elevator going down, she exhaled. The elevator, as if recognizing the significance of the moment, traveled smoothly to the 14th floor with no stops. "Thank you," she told it. "That was unexpectedly cooperative." The elevator doors opened. She had 3 messages waiting. One from Gordon, which said simply, "Well done." One from Joe, which said, I'm going to need to tell you about that slide presentation later because I designed those slides and I did not design those slides. And one from a number she didn't have saved which said stairwell, 5 minutes, if you have time. She looked at the number, thought about it. On my way, she typed back. Theodore Lorne was already on the landing between 13 and 14 when she got there. He looked like he had walked there quickly but was pretending he hadn't. That was not, he said, what I expected. What did you expect? I thought you might send an email. He paused. I would have sent an email. Emails can be ignored. They can also be documented. I have the whole thing on the building security system. She leaned against the railing. Which I own now, technically. He looked at her for a moment. Then the thing near his mouth happened again, the not quite smile, and this time it made it slightly further. The woman who spoke, he said. Petra. From corporate risk, yes. She's been trying to get that review process addressed for over a year. I know, Gordon told me. What are you going to do about it? Mara considered. Fix it, and make it someone's actual job to make sure it doesn't happen again. She tilted her head. Why do you know about Petra's submission? Because I was on the risk subcommittee in 2022. He said it with a steadiness that suggested he had thought about this. I read it. I raised it. I was told it was being reviewed. He paused. It wasn't. You could have pushed harder. I could have. I didn't. He met her eyes. That's something I'm thinking about. The stairwell was quiet around them. 14 flights of honest air. You're not what I expected either, Mara said. What did you expect from a board member? Someone who learned to be comfortable with comfortable. Something shifted in his face. Not dramatic. Just a small, accurate acknowledgement. I grew up in a small town, he said, northern BC, about 400 people. My family's been there for 3 generations. He looked at the window in the stairwell door, the narrow rectangle of gray city sky. I spent 15 years in corporate finance trying to talk myself into thinking that was just context, background. He paused. I'm less convinced of that than I used to be. Mara looked at him. Joe wants to redesign the internal feedback system, she said. He blinked at the shift. The one from communications? Yes, she has ideas. Good ones. You've known her for 4 days. I know enough. She picked up her bag. I'm going to give her the project. I thought you should know because it'll need board-level sign-off and I'd rather not have it late. He was quiet for a moment. You move fast. I move when I can see clearly, she said. I've had 5 years of distance and an extremely thorough due diligence process. I can see pretty clearly. She turned toward the door. Mara, she turned back. He was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Not unguarded exactly, just present, as if he had decided to stop standing at a careful angle to whatever this was. There's a place in Kensington Market, he said, that makes very good pierogi. It's not the kind of place that shows up in a search. You have to know someone. He paused. I know someone. Mara looked at him for a moment. That is, she said, a very Canadian way to ask someone to dinner. I'm a very Canadian person. So am I. She thought about it. When? Friday. If you're not traveling, I'm not traveling Friday, then Friday. She pushed open the stairwell door. Somewhere above them, on the 15th floor, the conference room was probably still reorganizing itself from the afternoon's events. Somewhere below, in the lobby, Penny was making excellent coffee for whoever still needed it at 4:15 in the afternoon. And somewhere in the building's internal communications department, Joe Hartwell had a folder full of ideas that were about to become someone's actual job. Mara walked back toward her office. The corridor was quiet and the lights were the end-of-day kind, golden and slightly slanted, and she had the particular feeling she sometimes recognized as the beginning of something real. She paused at her office door and looked back at the stairwell. Then she went in, sat down, and started reading the next file. Friday came with the specific kind of light that late autumn in Toronto produces, sharp and pale and very clean, the kind that makes everything look like it's in focus. Mara arrived at the restaurant at 6:58. Theodore was already there. This she had half expected. The place was small and warm, with wooden tables and the smell of something with butter in it and a chalkboard menu that changed daily. A man with a gray braid and an apron came out of the kitchen and shook Theodore's hand with the ease of long familiarity. This is Mara, Theodore said. She's recently returned to a building she used to work in, under different circumstances. The man with the braid, his name turned out to be Dimitro, looked at her with the frank interest of someone who is curious about people without being intrusive about it. Different how? She owns it now, Theodore said. Dimitro considered this. Good. He went back to the kitchen. Mara looked at Theodore. That's all? Just good? Dimitro is a man of decisive opinions. Theodore held out her chair. He also makes the best cabbage rolls in the city, so his endorsement is worth having. They ate slowly, the way people eat when the food is good and the conversation is better. She told him about Fredericton, about the drive to Toronto at 22 with 2 suitcases, and the specific terror of being new in a large city and not knowing anyone. He told her about growing up in a town where 3 families, including his own, built something lasting out of what looked from the outside like nothing much. My grandfather always said that the people who dismiss something small are usually the people who never built anything, he said. My mother said something like that, in French. She grew up in Moncton. Are you bilingual? Functionally. My French is better when I'm tired. She turned her water glass. She would have had things to say about that boardroom on day 15. Your mother? She worked 30 years in a hospital administrative office. She knew everything about how institutions pretend to communicate. Mara smiled. She once submitted the same budget correction for 11 months in a row until the finance director finally had to approve it. Because she kept the Traholst, Theodore said quietly. Yes, different building. Same story. He was quiet for a moment in the way she had come to recognize, not absence but attention. The boardroom, he said. I should have been there. You weren't invited either. I know, but I'm on the board. I could have pushed to be included. He set his fork down. I keep finding these moments where I could have done something sooner. It's not comfortable. No, she agreed, it isn't. Does it get easier, finding those moments? Mara thought about the parking garage 5 years ago, the 11 minutes, the decision she made on the drive home. I don't think easier is the right word. I think it gets more useful. You get better at doing something with them instead of just sitting in them. He looked at her with the kind of directness that doesn't ask permission. What did you do with yours? He asked. The one from 5 years ago. She was quiet for a moment. I built a company, she said. I hired people who had been told they were too quiet or too careful or too difficult, and I gave them things to do that mattered. I read everything I could about Alderton and Marsh for 3 years, and then I made an offer. She paused. And I came back. Was it what you thought it would be? She considered. No, I thought it would feel like winning something. It doesn't feel like that. What does it feel like? She thought of Penny arranging paper cups, of Joe pulling pasta containers from the back of the fridge, of Petra Holst uncrossing her arms and finally saying the thing she had been holding for 14 months, of Gordon who had been keeping careful records for 6 years and 4 months. It feels like building something, Mara said. Which is better? Dimitro came out to refill their glasses without being asked, in the way of good hosts who pay attention. Second round, he said, and went back. Theodore watched him go, then looked back at Mara. I want to ask you something, and I want to ask it directly. I prefer direct, I know. He folded his hands on the table. The board seat is going to be restructured as part of the acquisition. Some seats are going to change. I don't know yet what that means for mine. It means, Mara said, that I want people on the board who tell me the truth rather than the version of it that's most comfortable to say. Which is a shorter list than it should be, she looked at him. I read the risk subcommittee minutes from 2022. Your objections are on record. He went very still. You did your job, she said. You just didn't have the authority to make it stick. That's a different problem. She picked up her glass. Your seat isn't going anywhere. He was quiet for a long moment in the particular way of someone who has been prepared for a different answer. Thank you, he said at last. Don't thank me. Just keep doing what you were doing in that subcommittee, and tell me sooner. He almost smiled. It made it further than usual. I can do that, he said. Outside, the street was cold and bright and very Toronto. That specific combination of rush and stillness that the city does in the hours between dinner and night. They walked to the corner, which was where their directions diverged. Mara had a 15-minute walk. Theodore had a car. The cabbage rolls, she said. Were they acceptable? They were exceptional. You can tell Dimitro I said so. He'll be unbearable about it. Theodore turned up his collar against the wind. There's also a place in the West End that does excellent Vietnamese. And one on Dundas that has a pho that genuinely requires planning. Mara looked at him. Are you building a curriculum? I'm building a case, he said, for the second dinner. She considered this with appropriate seriousness. I might know someone, she said, who could potentially be convinced. He nodded once in the measured way of a man who does not perform enthusiasm but feels it. Good. She started walking. Then she turned back. Theodore. He looked at her. The parking garage machine on the first day. Was the honking from behind me actually you? He said nothing for a moment. Then, that was a very small car and I was running late. It was a very prolonged honk. I was later than I'd realized. Mara turned around and kept walking. Behind her, she heard what might have been a quiet laugh. The specific kind. Not performative, not polite. The kind that happens because something was genuinely funny and there was no point pretending otherwise. She found, walking back through the sharp October air of her city, that she was smiling. Not at the situation, or the building she owned, or the week she had managed to navigate, but at something smaller and more specific. The particular pleasure of finding a person who surprises you, in a good direction, when you had not known you were looking for that. The parking garage machine worked perfectly the following Monday. Mara pressed the button once. The ticket appeared immediately, without drama, without ceremony, without any suggestion that it had ever been anything other than cooperative. Mara took the ticket, drove into the garage, and parked. Then she looked at the machine in her rearview mirror for a long moment. "Fine," she said. "We'll call it even." She picked up her coffee from Penny's cart, which she had detoured to before the garage because she had learned from the week, and walked into the building, and into whatever came next, which she had decided to face, as she faced most things, with precision and coffee, and the steady knowledge that she had already done the hard part. The rest was just building.